Welcome back. Now, the Madlanga Commission has heard how IDAC's Deputy Director of Public Prosecutions, Adv Peter Serunye, prepared a list of written questions highlighting concerns about the investigation into Lieutenant-General Dumisani Khumalo and 6 other crime intelligence officials. Now, Adv Serunye testified that after receiving the 4-volume docket, he was not satisfied that the corruption charges against the accused were actually sustainable, and he told the Commission that he later amended the charge sheet, reducing it to 2 counts, including a conspiracy charge under the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act. Now, Serunia further testified that he repeatedly questioned why the senior police officials had been arrested and charged with corruption. But for some analysis on this, we are now joined by senior lecturer at the Wits School of Law, Dr. Shadi Maganoe. Dr. Shadi, thanks so much for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Morning, and thanks for having me.
So IDAC has been very, very interesting. But what's your assessment of Advocate Serunye and his testimony?
I think for me, the central legal concern from that testimony is whether the state basically exercised its cohesive powers on the basis of a properly established evidential and legal foundation. And the reason I'm saying coercive is because the NPA Act gives IDAC very powerful powers, if you can. And remember, when we speak about Section 28, that's where they get the powers to basically subpoena all forms of information that you and I wouldn't ordinarily give up. So I think that's why I'm saying the real question here is whether the state exercised its coercive powers on the basis of a properly established evidential and legal foundation. And I think it's important because we're not talking about an investigation that remained at the suspicion stage. People were arrested, charged, brought before court, released on bail, and basically were subjected to specific restrictions. So Advocate Serunye's testimony is important because he says that when he examined the docket, he had serious questions about the evidence supporting the charges and even questioned why these senior police officials had been arrested and charged with corruption. So the issue is not simply whether IDAC had made mistakes. The question is whether at the time the state decided to arrest and charge those people, if it had sufficient evidence to justify doing so. And that is a rule of law question.
And then it obviously, Dr. Maganoe also speaks to the fact that there has to be a certain legal threshold, one would imagine, that has to be satisfied before proceeding on to authorizing arrests, among other things. And to his testimony, Advocate Serunye said he thought at the very least it was premature, the arrest of Lieutenant-General Dumisani Khumalo and his 6 co-accused. But then what happens to those basic rules of law and the thresholds that need to be met, given the seniority of some of the people involved here?
I think it comes to what he basically said when he said there was no prima facie case for corruption against those senior intelligence officials. And I think in as much as we need to be careful with the term prima facie, I think we've heard it quite a lot of times, because the reason why I'm saying we need to be careful with it, because it does not mean that the state had to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt before it can arrest or charge someone. But it does mean that there must be a proper factual and legal foundation for the criminal allegation. And that's where Advocate Serunye's evidence becomes particularly very important. The underlying theory of the concerned issue that he had with the investigation was of Dineo Mgwele, essentially, right? That she had been parachuted into a specific position. But the commission had heard that she was actually overqualified for that position. So there's a very important legal question that comes from that. What was the evidential bridge between an alleged problematic appointment and the conclusion that corruption had been committed by the people who were arrested? So you can't simply establish that an appointment was controversial or irregular and then conclude that everyone connected to it has committed corruption. And the state has to establish the elements of the specific offense and then have evidence connecting each accused person to those elements. That is why Advocate Serunye's evidence is so important, that the absence of a prima facie case is so important in the sense that that is the reason why he was asking the questions that he was asking, because he wasn't satisfied that there was a factual foundation for those processes that were taken.
And then he also testifies about how, and this wasn't a norm according to his testimony, the case was handed to a junior in his office, a junior prosecutor, and given the magnitude of those implicated and the case itself ultimately, that was also very interesting because he then went on to say that he felt that he and his junior colleague were actually set up regarding that particular case.
Exactly. And his testimony demonstrates why oversight is important. So, prosecutorial oversight is important because this is precisely where their independence comes from or where that safeguard comes from. So, the issue, I think, is not that junior prosecutors cannot handle serious cases. I think they can, right? The question was, who was responsible for exercising that senior prosecutorial judgment over the case of this magnitude? And was that oversight actually exercised? So according to Advocate Serunye, he only became aware of the matter after the arrests. So even though a junior prosecutor who reported to him had been involved in that matter. So he also questioned why the prosecutor who had ordinarily dealt with that crime, with crime intelligence matters, was not involved in that process. So it also raises questions about the process and how prosecutorial powers were being used. And then also he eventually examined the matter and raised those questions about the evidence and the charges. So the commission needs to establish why those questions were apparently not resolved before the arrests were made and before those people were brought before court. And that is the institutional issue that we have with IDAC, or that we are seeing with IDAC, where the safeguards designed to prevent an inadequately supported prosecution actually functioning.
So around the question of prosecutorial independence, where you have Advocate Serunye saying that he had repeatedly questioned the strength of that corruption case that IDAC had brought against the crime intelligence officials. What should we read into that, given his own seniority and how he seemed to have been sidelined in all of this?
I think it speaks to an issue of leadership within IDAC. It's not just an accountability issue, because if he's a senior prosecutor and he asked questions and they were not answered, then it speaks to how processes were followed. It speaks to the issue of leadership within IDAC. And I think what I would say is that Advocate Serunye's testimony raises serious questions about how prosecutorial and investigative power was exercised. Whether that amounts to an abuse of power requires findings about the facts, and I think that's what basically the commission is trying to find out. Did IDAC abuse its powers? And I think you and I can't necessarily make a conclusion out of that, because the commission also has not made a conclusion. So we would have to wait for the commission to make a conclusion. And then I think based on what comes out of the recommendations of the Madlanga Commission, the people who were subjected to arrests could basically use those findings to probably find some form of recourse against IDAC.
And then Advocate Serunye also testified that the critical investigative work for those crime intelligence arrests was not completed prior to the operation, and that he personally was only formally joined in this matter after those arrests had already been effected. So how does that, cart before the horse sort of approach reflect on, again, the procedural integrity of IDAC as an anti-corruption institution?
I think it speaks to exactly that. There's an issue of an institutional culture and leadership within IDAC. And I think also, if you remember the announcement that the minister made, it speaks to that. I think the leadership has basically realized that there are challenges or there are issues of institutional culture and leadership within IDAC, and they are trying to remedy that through the announcements that they made. But it doesn't necessarily mean that those who have probably, or those who will probably be found responsible for putting the cart before the horse, won't be held accountable. I think the challenge here is that we know that Advocate Johnson has resigned. So in terms of holding her accountable in her position, I think that is going to be a challenge because she's no longer an employee of IDAC. However, the NPA has announced that they have proceeded with criminal investigations against her, and that's probably one of the ways that she will be held accountable, apart from those who have been suspended. So this speaks to, or Advocate Serunye's evidence speaks to that issue of leadership and institutional culture within IDAC.
And then we are fast running out of time. I have a few more questions that I want to ask. One of them speaking to the contradictory evidence that was led or adduced to at the Commission by Advocate Johnson and now Advocate Serunia, given again the seniority of both these people and how they blatantly contradict each other on such a high-profile case with such high stakes. Again, what should we read into that in the broader scheme of things? And also, just with regard to the prosecutorial processes, the manipulation, and this seems to be something that may have been a lot more widespread at IDAC than what the Commission is focusing on now. Would that be a fair assessment to make as lay people from what we are hearing at the Commission?
I think at this point, it's important not to speculate as how far widespread it was. But I think what we can take from Advocate Serunye's testimony is similar to what we took from Rem Sami's testimony. So what we can pick up from both testimonies is that Advocate Johnson portrayed herself as somebody who wasn't aware or who wasn't included in the prosecutorial or the investigation processes. But what we are finding out is that she was actually very much involved, and it wasn't just an oversight thing. She was very much involved in those investigations, and she was making decisions in there. So, and I think what is important to take away from this is that here, what basically happened is that people's liberty, dignity, reputations, and careers were actually affected by the decisions that Advocate Johnson and her team had basically made. So these individuals were arrested, they were brought before court, and they were actually charged with serious offenses. So it speaks to exactly the kind of power that IDAC wields through the NPA Act. And I think the important question that the Madlanga Commission is trying to establish is to what extent, if any, whether IDAC abused its public power. And I think that is going to be very important, because those who are basically impacted by that decision, or the decisions that were made using legislation that was actually meant to hold those who abuse public power accountable, is going to come in handy for them should they seek that recourse.
And I know you say we should caution against broader speculation, but from what we've heard, the testimony that we've heard so far over several weeks in this IDAC stream at the Madlanga Commission, can we look at IDAC, at least in this narrow context, as a neutral investigative body, or some institution that has been weaponized, as some have claimed beforehand?
I think for me, it's important to remember why IDAC was established to start with. Remember, it came from one of the recommendations from the State Capture Commission so that it could basically tackle or investigate high-level corruption. So I think IDAC still plays an important role. I think here the issue is, yes, it goes beyond individuals. It speaks to the culture of the institution. But I think for me, the important question is to ask ourselves whether state power to arrest and charge people was used within its constitutional restraints or confinements. And I think it speaks to that issue of whether the leadership basically abused the power that was given to them through IDAC. Whether we can speculate that they have basically abused or they have used their positions to target specific people, I think we need to leave that to the Commission, because the Commission also has not confirmed. So I think when public power is exercised against senior police officials like what we've seen, the question must always be what evidence justified it, who tested the evidence, and where the proper prosecutorial safeguards followed.
Dr. Shadi Maganoe, always a pleasure. Thanks so much. Senior lecturer at the Wits School of Law, Dr. Shadi Maganoe, unpacking Advocate Peter Serunye's testimony at the Madlanga Commission. And of course, that IDAC stream continuing, as Kenny will alert us to.